So moving on to number 2 of the archetypes or definitions that we're talking about. So far I've counted 17, but what's interesting is these archetypes, you can have more than one, and most people have some percentage of these 3 that we're talking about today. So just because your primary archetype isn't talked about today doesn't mean that it's not talked about in the workbook. But these are chosen because just about everybody has one of these, if not all 3. So the second one I want to talk about is, who here is a multitasker? What is probably the most insane multitask extravaganza that you do? And think about that. Because personally, and this is not what I recommend, I have been known to drive a stick shift, eat, drink, talk on the phone, and, drive. Not recommended, but that is probably the most extreme form of multitasking that I do. But the point that I'm trying to make is that we all are multitasking a lot of our lives, and we don't necessarily consider that a bad thing. Yes, obviously there's sometimes we need to be more present, we need to be more personable, we need to be more in the now. But, I have no issue brushing my teeth in the shower, right? That works for me, that's fine. I don't mind listening to a podcast while I work out. There's some instances of multitasking that actually do lead to more human experience. So, this brings me to the person that's waiting to be happy. They're waiting to request happiness until something else happens. Their experience of happiness is being postponed until some other condition is being met. So, common conditions could be goals or promotions or financial rewards, or it's important for them to move to a bigger, better house, or to be perceived as being more successful, or, when I've got my PhD, I'll be happy. It could be when I started my family, that'll make me happy. But it doesn't always have to be an exercise in vanity. So there can be real needs here. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a big house. It could be, well, I want a safer house, or I want a handicap accessible house for my husband, or I need to make more money because I've got more bills, or I need to help my parents with their bills. So it's not necessarily what could be seen as frivolous, which is a whole nother conversation. But, so these needs could be serious. They could be not fun needs. They could be needs, not desires or wants. So it is tough to be happy when someone is suffering or sick or hurt. So you could be having I'm waiting to be happy until my family is healthy, until my family is safe. And I get that. I totally understand that it is difficult to be happy when you feel like a part of you, a very important part of you, is not. And sometimes it can feel like a betrayal to actually work on our happiness practice while someone we care about is not. We feel guilty. We feel unworthy of that person. Breathe in, breathe out. However, I call this type of person a waiter. The archetype is a waiter, not to be confused with the restaurant waiter, someone who's waiting. So they are waiting for their conditions to be met before they're happy. And I'd like to bring this back around to that multitasking exercise I gave you. So if I can drive a stick shift and eat and drink and talk on the phone, then what about emotional multitasking. So I can be compassionate and express grief or express empathy or be emotionally available to someone else who's going through a rough time, and I can still be internally happy. I can still have an internal happiness practice. My happiness practice is not contingent on any other conditions. Life doesn't stop. And sometimes I really wish it did. You know, this chick sometimes could definitely use a like pause button. It's like, okay, I can't deal with anything else right now. You know, they're sick, they're in the hospital, they're going chemo treatments, you know, horse is going through a laminitic episode, my cat is senile, there's an arson loose. I mean, I had enough. Time out. And I'll be happy when all this is sorted, right? It doesn't work that way. Life happens. Life is on like a conveyor belt, and it just keeps going by, which is a good thing. Sometimes it's a challenge. So the point is, you have to be enjoying the life where you're at on your conveyor belt. It doesn't pause. It doesn't stop. So putting your happiness as a contingent on something else happening that is happening in its own time frame isn't a good approach. So one of the happiness interviews I conducted was this really sweet lady in Scotland. And so she's telling me that, you know, just with the way her life went, she's ended up being a caretaker for most of her family. So, you know, crazy home life as a child. So she ended up taking care of her younger brothers and sisters and raised them up. And then she ended up taking care of her estranged mother. And then she died, and she ended up with her estranged father. And so she's taking care of him, and he died. And then she ended up with one of her brothers who was in a car wreck who needed in-home care. She ended up taking care of him. So she actually, over a span of 40 years, was the caretaker for all these people. And so she kept saying she was waiting to have freedom, to be happy. She was waiting to have her own life, to be happy. And so she said, it suddenly dawned on me that I could be waiting until I died to be happy. Just because your life necessarily isn't going the way you want doesn't mean that you can't be happy. So I want to illustrate that again, that even though you aren't living the life that you could wish you were, it doesn't mean that you can't have an internal happiness practice. And actually what you will find, dollars to donuts, I promise, is that once you have an internal practice of happiness, you will be able to give yourself what you need to be happier, which actually starts to raise up your life experience that you're having. If you want to talk more about that, you can email me. We can set up a time to chat. But for this webinar, I want to move on past that one and finish up because I don't want to bore you too much. So having the full human experience includes being happy. And you're not being frivolous. You're not being silly. You're not being unserious. You are allowed to be happy as an internal practice no matter what. So if you're waiting, if you're a waiter, you're waiting on being happy until these other conditions are met, how is that affecting you? And what would you do differently if you decided to consciously create your happiness now? What would change for you? How would you feel different? How would you interact with the world differently? So being able to go through these questions and really answer from an expansive viewpoint, what would be different if you did not wait, if you did not set these conditions up that had to be met before you got happy? What would that look like instead?